My name is Elena Wright. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've lived in roles that rarely draw attention to themselves. I've worked behind the scenes, organizing, managing, smoothing edges before anyone else noticed there was a problem. I've been a wife, a partner, a stabilizer, the kind of woman people rely on without ever quite seeing. If you asked the people around me back then to describe me, most of them would say I was comfortable, non-confrontational. They might say I was lucky, they might say I married well. Some of them said something harsher when they thought I couldn't hear, that I was a gold digger, that I knew exactly what I was doing and that what I was doing was staying. I didn't argue with them, not because they were right, but because their assumptions worked in my favor far longer than they realized. I want to say this clearly from the beginning. I did not leave with money. I didn't take property, assets, or anything that could be measured or divided. In fact, I walked away with nothing, and that terrified them, terrified him. Terrified the people who were certain I wouldn't survive without what they believed I depended on. What I left with was invisible, and what they lost took a long time for them to understand, because it was never listed in a contract, never framed on a wall, never discussed out loud. This story unfolds slowly, the way real power shifts usually do. There is no single explosive moment, no dramatic confrontation you can point to and say, that's when it all changed. Instead, there are small cuts that go unnoticed, roles that harden over time, silence that begins as endurance and slowly turns into choice. I'm not telling this story to inspire anger or applause. I'm telling it because there are so many people living inside similar misunderstandings, seen as dependent when they are simply patient, dismissed as weak when they are observant, underestimated because they don't announce their limits. If you're expecting a story of revenge, this won't be that. There is no shouting here, no humiliation, just consequences that arrive quietly and cannot be undone. As you listen, you might recognize pieces of your own life reflected back at you. You might hear things you've been told, or things you've told yourself to make staying easier. My promise is honesty, without embellishment, without justification. Not to persuade you, but to tell the truth as I experienced it. So before we move forward, I want to ask you something gently, without expectation. Have you ever noticed that the moment you stopped trying to be understood was the moment others finally began to feel uncertain? To understand how everything unfolded, you first need to understand who I was to them, not who I actually was, but the version of me that existed comfortably in their minds. I was easy. That was the word people used most often, usually with a smile that implied praise. Easy to live with, easy to please, easy to rely on. I handled schedules, paperwork, family obligations, and social calendars. I remembered birthdays, deadlines, and renewal dates. I absorbed stress so others didn't have to carry it. When something went wrong, it rarely reached the surface because I intercepted it early and quietly. In public, I was polite and unassuming. I didn't dominate conversations or correct people when they spoke over me. I let assumptions pass without challenge, not because I agreed with them, but because challenging them would have required energy I was saving for more important things. This restraint was interpreted as softness. My silence was mistaken for a lack of depth. In our marriage, I occupied a very specific space. I was the dependable one, the background constant, the person who didn't need much. My needs were considered minimal because I rarely voiced them. My contributions were seen as natural extensions of my personality rather than work that required skill or thought. When things functioned smoothly, no one asked how. When they didn't, the expectation was that I would fix it. Friends and extended family developed their own shorthand for me. I was taken care of. Lucky. Secure. There was an unspoken narrative that I had traded ambition for comfort, independence for access. Some of them were less subtle. I heard the word gold digger more than once, usually framed as a joke, delivered with a laugh that dared me to object. I didn't. Objecting would have required me to explain myself, and I had learned long ago that explanations are rarely given the respect people think they deserve. When you explain, you invite judgment. When you stay quiet, you gather information. What no one seemed to notice was how much of their stability passed through me first. Bills were paid on time because I tracked them. Opportunities weren't missed because I remembered them. Conflicts didn't escalate because I softened them before they hardened. I wasn't in charge, but I was adjacent to every moving part. Still, I remained invisible. At gatherings, people asked my husband about work, investments, and plans. When they turned to me, it was to ask how I filled my time, as if time were something handed to me rather than something I managed with intention. I smiled. I answered lightly. I learned which answers made people comfortable and repeated them. Over time, the role calcified. I became predictable in the way furniture is predictable, noticed only when moved, missed only when absent. There was no malice in most of it. That's what made it more dangerous. Neglect wrapped in politeness is easy to accept, especially when you've been trained to believe that being low maintenance is a virtue. I told myself stories to make it make sense, that this was a partnership, that every relationship has imbalances, that visibility comes with a cost I simply wasn't willing to pay. I believed that staying calm was maturity, that staying quiet was strength. And in some ways it was. But what I didn't realize yet was how thoroughly I had been categorized, not just as a person, but as a function, as something that existed within the system, not something that could ever step outside of it. They believed I stayed because I needed what the system provided. They believed I had no leverage because I never displayed it. That belief would shape every decision they made later, every dismissal, every oversight, every moment they assumed I would endure rather than choose. At the time, I thought invisibility was neutral, a safe middle ground. I didn't yet understand that being unseen doesn't mean being unaffected. It means no one notices when you begin to pull away. And I was already pulling away, long before anyone thought to look. The first moment didn't announce itself as important. That's what made it dangerous. It happened in a room full of people, during a conversation that had nothing to do with me. At least that's how it appeared. We were at a dinner with friends, the kind of evening where everyone speaks just loudly enough to sound interesting. The topic drifted toward finances, then investments, then the familiar, casual boasting that comes with both. I wasn't particularly engaged, but I was listening. I always listened. Someone asked my husband how he managed everything so smoothly. He laughed, took credit, and then added, almost as an afterthought, "Well, Elena doesn't really worry about that stuff. I handle the important parts." It was said lightly, no malice, a joke, almost. No one corrected him. No one looked at me to check whether I agreed. The conversation moved on as if nothing had happened. Plates were passed, wine was poured. Laughter filled the space where a question could have existed. I felt something tighten, not in my chest, but somewhere quieter. A recognition. Not hurt exactly, but clarity, because I knew with absolute certainty that what he had just said wasn't true. I was the one who tracked expenditures. I flagged inconsistencies. I scheduled meetings he forgot. I prepared documents he signed without reading them carefully. I wasn't in control, but I was deeply involved. Still, I smiled. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct him. Doing so would have shifted the mood, forced an explanation, and invited debate. And part of me wanted to see what would happen if I let the moment pass unchallenged. Later that night, alone, I replayed it, not with anger, but with curiosity. I asked myself whether this was new or whether it had always been there, and I'd simply chosen not to notice. I remembered other moments, smaller, quieter. Decisions were made without consulting me, assumptions stated as fact, praise given selectively. This was just the first time it had been said out loud in front of others. I told myself it didn't matter, that it was a social slip, an imprecise sentence, nothing worth holding on to. But I did hold on to it, not emotionally, strategically. I stored it the way you store a data point that doesn't fit the model yet, but feels like it might later. After that night, I began noticing patterns, not in his behavior alone, but in how others responded to me after he spoke for me. Questions stopped coming, decisions were announced, not discussed. The role I had been quietly playing was being publicly defined without my input. And still, I said nothing. Silence had always been my default, but this time it wasn't avoidance. It was an observation. I wanted to know how far the assumption would go if left uninterrupted. I wanted to understand what people believed about me when they thought I wasn't listening. What surprised me most wasn't the dismissal itself. It was how easily it was accepted, how quickly a narrative becomes reality once it's spoken confidently enough. I realized then that this wasn't about one comment. It was about authorship, about who was allowed to describe whom. That night marked the first small cut, not because it hurt, but because it revealed something. A boundary I hadn't known was being crossed, a version of me that was being quietly rewritten without my consent. I went to sleep with a strange calm, not resignation, not anger, just awareness. And awareness, I would soon learn, is rarely neutral. Once you notice the pattern, it doesn't stay isolated for long. After that dinner, moments like it began appearing everywhere. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with the consistency of something that had already been normalized. Comments framed as jokes, decisions presented as conclusions, conversations where my presence felt optional rather than integral. At first, I treated each instance as its own event, a miscommunication, a rushed assumption, a harmless oversight. I told myself that relationships, especially long ones, develop shortcuts. That familiarity can look like dismissal when it's really just comfort. I wanted that to be true. So I adjusted. I softened my language even more. I became careful not to sound challenging. I waited for the right time to speak, which somehow never arrived. When plans were changed without asking me, I adapted. When my input was summarized incorrectly, I let it go. I learned how to swallow irritation without letting it harden into resentment. From the outside, nothing seemed wrong. That was the point. Disrespect rarely announces itself as cruelty. More often, it arrives disguised as efficiency, as someone else deciding for you because they assume they already know your answer. The hardest part was how reasonable it all seemed. There was always an explanation. He was busy. The situation was urgent. It wasn't personal. And because none of it was overt, I couldn't point to a single moment and say, this is where it crossed the line. The line kept moving, and I kept stepping back to avoid standing in its way. I also began noticing how others mirrored his behavior. Friends deferred to him even on matters I managed. Family members checked with him about plans that affected us both. Invitations were extended through him, not to me. I became an accessory to my own life, introduced as context rather than as a person. When I did speak up, gently, carefully, it was often met with surprise, as if my opinion had arrived unannounced. Sometimes it was met with reassurance. You don't need to worry about that. I've got it handled. Statements that sounded protective, but functioned as closures. I started telling myself that staying quiet was maturity, that choosing peace over correctness was a form of wisdom. I believed that if I just remained consistent, reasonable, and unthreatening, things would rebalance on their own. But they didn't. Instead, my silence became evidence. Evidence that I agreed. Evidence that I didn't care. Evidence that I was exactly who they thought I was. Someone content to be carried along rather than consulted. I remember one afternoon in particular. I had spent weeks organizing something complex. Documents, timelines, contingencies. When the moment came, he presented the outcome as if it had materialized on its own. I stood beside him, listening to my own work described as inevitable. No one asked how it had come together. No one thanked me, and I didn't correct them. That was the moment I realized something unsettling. The disrespect wasn't increasing, it was stabilizing. It had found its comfortable level, and I was helping maintain it. Not because I was weak, but because I was trying to be fair, trying to be understanding, trying to preserve something that, in hindsight, only existed because I kept adjusting myself to fit it. I wasn't angry yet. I was tired in a very specific way. The kind of tired that comes from constantly translating yourself into something smaller, so others don't feel challenged by your presence. And still, I stayed quiet, because part of me believed that if I endured long enough, I would eventually be seen, that patience would be rewarded, that consistency would speak louder than confrontation. I hadn't yet learned that patience, when misunderstood, becomes permission. There's a moment when you realize you're no longer participating in a dynamic, you're performing a role inside it. I can't tell you exactly when that moment happened, only that once it did, I couldn't unsee it. By then, expectations had settled around me like furniture that no one remembers choosing. I was the reliable one, the one who would adapt, the one who didn't need to be consulted because I would understand. My value was measured by how little friction I created, by how seamlessly I filled gaps without drawing attention to them. It wasn't that anyone sat me down and told me who I was supposed to be. The role was assigned through repetition, through what was noticed and what wasn't, through the way my contributions were treated as default settings rather than deliberate acts. I was useful, which meant I was invisible. In conversations, became the listener. In decisions, the implementer. In conflicts, the diffuser. If something required emotional labor, I handled it. If something required long-term thinking, I prepared it. If something went wrong, I absorbed the impact so it didn't ripple outward. This was praised as stability, as loyalty, as being low maintenance. What no one asked was whether I wanted that role, or what it cost to sustain it. I began noticing how quickly people grew uncomfortable when I stepped even slightly outside of it. If I paused before agreeing, there was tension. If I asked a clarifying question, it was treated as resistance. The system worked best when I was predictable, when I responded the way I always had. I realized then that my silence had become part of the structure. Removing it would require the structure to adjust, and no one benefits from a system that has to reconfigure itself. At home, the pattern was even clearer. Plans were made with the assumption that I would accommodate them. Time was allocated to me rather than with me. My schedule was considered flexible by default, even when it wasn't. When I expressed fatigue, it was met with reassurance, not relief, comfort instead of change. And I accepted it, outwardly. Inwardly, something shifted, not dramatically, not angrily, just a quiet recalibration. I started paying attention not to what people said about me, but to how they behaved when they thought I would comply. I observed how often my agreement was assumed before it was given, how rarely my absence was considered. It became clear that I wasn't seen as a partner. I was seen as infrastructure. Infrastructure is only noticed when it fails, and I had spent years making sure it never did. I didn't confront anyone about this realization. There was no benefit in announcing it. Roles once assigned are defended instinctively. If I challenged it directly, I would be accused of changing, of being difficult, of disrupting something that worked. So I didn't disrupt it. I fulfilled the role flawlessly, while slowly detaching my identity from it. I stopped measuring my worth by how smoothly things ran. I stopped expecting recognition from people who benefited from my quietness. And most importantly, I stopped assuming that staying meant belonging. This wasn't withdrawal, it was repositioning. They still saw me the same way: reliable, useful, invisible. What they didn't see was that I was no longer anchoring myself to that perception. I was observing it from a distance, the way you observe a system you may one day leave. At the time, they believed I would always be there, steady, accommodating, unquestioning. They didn't realize the role they had assigned me was temporary. There wasn't an argument. There wasn't a betrayal dramatic enough to retell at dinner parties. That's what makes this moment difficult to explain to people who expect transformation to be loud. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. I was alone at home, sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers I had organized earlier that day. Nothing was wrong. Nothing was urgent. And yet, for the first time in a long while, I felt completely detached from the life I was maintaining. I remember looking around and realizing how much of my time was spent sustaining systems I didn't belong to. I wasn't building anything that reflected me. I was maintaining something that functioned without acknowledging my presence. And I understood with sudden clarity that if I disappeared, the structure wouldn't collapse immediately, but it would become unstable in ways no one could name. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me still. I thought about all the times I had stayed quiet to keep the peace, all the times I had adjusted my expectations instead of questioning why they weren't being met. I saw the pattern, but not as something done to me, but something I had participated in because it felt safer than uncertainty. In that moment, I stopped asking whether I was being treated fairly. That question had kept me trapped in evaluation mode, always waiting for validation. Instead, I asked something simpler and more dangerous. What happens if I stop maintaining this? The answer wasn't fear. It was a possibility. Not the kind that promises instant relief or dramatic freedom, but the kind that invites responsibility. I realized that staying silent wasn't the problem. Staying attached to the outcome was. I had been quiet while still hoping to be seen. That hope tethered me. So I let it go. I didn't make any declarations. I didn't pack bags or confront anyone. I finished my tea. I folded the papers neatly, and somewhere between standing up and turning off the light, I made a decision that would shape everything that followed. I would stop offering myself as infrastructure. From that day on, my silence changed. It was no longer endurance. It was an intention. I stopped filling gaps automatically. I stopped preemptively solving problems that weren't assigned to me. I still fulfilled my responsibilities, but only the ones that were explicitly mine. At first, nothing seemed different. That was expected. Systems don't register a change until the load shifts. But internally, I felt lighter, not happier, clearer. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't measuring my value by reaction. I was observing without attachment. That afternoon didn't look like a turning point from the outside. But inside, something fundamental had realigned. I wasn't planning an exit. I wasn't plotting anything. I was simply no longer available in the same way. And availability, I would soon learn, had been my most valuable asset. When silence stops being a reflex and becomes a decision, it changes texture. It becomes deliberate, contained, no longer porous. After that afternoon, I didn't announce any changes. I didn't withdraw affection or become distant in ways that could be named. I simply stopped anticipating, stopped cushioning, stopped translating unspoken needs into action before they reached the surface. From the outside, I looked the same, calm, agreeable, present. That's what made it so effective. When a detail was overlooked, I let it remain overlooked. When something wasn't scheduled, I didn't rescue it at the last minute. If a conversation moved forward without my input, I didn't interrupt to insert it later. I allowed the natural consequences of exclusion to exist without interference. People assumed I was tired, or distracted, or going through a phase. Those explanations were comfortable. They didn't require anyone to question the structure itself, and I didn't correct them. My husband, in particular, mistook the shift for compliance. Because I wasn't challenging him, he assumed nothing had changed. He filled the space with more certainty, more conclusions delivered as facts. He didn't notice that I had stopped responding emotionally to them. Silence, when chosen, becomes a mirror. It reflects back exactly what others project onto it, and what they projected was telling. I listened more than ever, but with distance. I noticed how often decisions relied on information that passed through me first. How many processes functioned because I quietly monitored them. I saw where dependencies existed that had never been acknowledged as such. And I documented everything. Not out of paranoia, out of clarity. I kept records of timelines, contributions, and conversations. I didn't interpret or editorialize. I simply preserved. Memory can be dismissed. Documentation cannot. There was a strange peace in this phase. Not joy, not satisfied, just steadiness. I wasn't performing invisibility anymore. I was using it. I moved through routines with precision, offering nothing extra, nothing unspoken. Occasionally, someone would notice, a question here, a comment there. You've been quiet. Is everything okay? I answered honestly but minimally. I'm fine, which was true. I had never felt more aligned. They assumed my quiet meant I was shrinking. What they didn't understand was that I was conserving energy, attention, choice. Silence had become a boundary they couldn't see, which made it impossible for them to challenge. And in that space, I began to see the system clearly enough to understand how and when it could be left. Not dramatically, not destructively, completely. While everything on the surface appeared unchanged, something else was happening beneath it. Something so quiet it never registered as movement at all. Because they believed I wasn't paying attention. That assumption gave me freedom. I began to see the structure of our shared life the way you see the wiring behind a wall once you know where to look. Not emotionally, logistically. I saw who relied on which information, who approved what without understanding it, and who assumed continuity without confirming it. I saw where trust had replaced verification, and where habit had replaced oversight. None of this required secrecy. Everything I learned was already available to me. I had access because I had always been useful. I simply started observing without intervening. I paid attention to how documents flowed. Which ones were skimmed? Which ones were signed automatically? I noticed which accounts were monitored actively and which ones were assumed stable because they always had been. I learned how decisions were justified after the fact and how rarely anyone traced them back to their origins. I also noticed how often my presence had been the final check. Quiet, informal, unacknowledged. A second set of eyes. A pause before commitment. Without that pause, things moved faster, but not necessarily better. Still, no one noticed the shift. They didn't notice that I stopped reminding. I stopped preparing contingency notes. I stopped absorbing confusion and turning it into clarity for others. They only noticed when outcomes became less smooth. And even then, they attributed it to external factors. This phase wasn't about planning an escape. It was about understanding leverage. Not the kind that comes from threats or confrontation, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly where your presence matters and where its absence will echo. I learned what would happen if I removed myself cleanly. What would continue without me, and what would quietly unravel. I didn't take anything. I didn't sabotage. I simply mapped. There was something sobering about this knowledge. It stripped away any lingering fantasy that I was indispensable in the way people romanticize. I wasn't irreplaceable. But replacement would require effort, awareness, and humility. Things that hadn't been practiced in a long time. And because I wasn't announcing any of this, there was no resistance, no defensiveness. I remained underestimated, which was the most stable position I could occupy. I also began preparing myself emotionally, detaching from outcomes, letting go of the desire to be acknowledged on my way out. I practiced imagining absence, not as loss, but as neutrality. I reminded myself that leaving didn't require justification. What they never noticed was that I had stopped negotiating internally, stopped hoping things would shift back, stopped waiting for recognition to arrive late and apologetic. By the time I finished observing, I didn't feel powerful. I felt calm, prepared. And preparation, when paired with silence, is often mistaken for nothing at all. The moment of clarity didn't arrive with excitement. There was no rush, no surge of triumph. It arrived the way truth often does when you've stopped forcing it. Quietly, undeniably, and without emotion. I was reviewing something routine, a set of documents I had seen many times before, ones that had passed through my hands so often they barely registered anymore. But this time I wasn't reviewing them to assist or support. I was looking at them as if I were already gone. That shift in perspective changed everything. I saw, in precise terms, where my presence had been compensating for gaps no one else knew existed. Not because they were hidden, but because they were inconvenient to acknowledge. I saw how much they relied on informal knowledge, on the context that lived in my head, on judgment calls that were never written down because they were assumed to be instinct. And I realized something that surprised me. If I left cleanly, without explanation, without transferring that informal knowledge, without staying helpful during the transition, nothing illegal would happen, nothing dramatic, but nothing would function the same way again. There was no single lever, no secret switch, just an accumulation of small dependencies that only mattered when removed all at once. This was the private reveal, not leverage in the way people imagine it. No threats, no ultimatums, no power plays, just understanding. The kind that comes when you see the full shape of a system and where you fit inside it. What struck me most was how unintentional it all was. No one had designed this dependency deliberately. It had formed because it was easier to let me handle things quietly than to fully understand them. My reliability had created its own shadow. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sober, because leverage carries responsibility. Knowing what would happen if I left meant deciding whether I was willing to let it happen, whether I could walk away without cushioning the fall, whether I could resist the urge to explain, to soften, to make it easier for everyone else. I sat with that for a long time. I didn't celebrate. I didn't plan theatrics. I simply accepted the reality. I could leave with nothing and still leave them exposed to the consequences of never having truly seen me. That understanding didn't make me powerful. It made me free. Knowing you can leave is not the same as deciding to do it. For a while, I sat in that space between awareness and action. I replayed scenarios quietly, not emotionally. I considered the paths available to me with the same detachment I had learned to apply to everything else. There were many ways forward, and most of them would have kept me comfortable. I could have stayed and renegotiated, asked for recognition, requested clearer roles, firmer boundaries, and shared authority. That path would have required conversations I was finally capable of having. It would have offered the illusion of repair. I could have left loudly, explained everything, pointed out the oversights, the dependencies, the ways I had been erased in plain sight. That path would have satisfied a certain narrative, one where departure is justified through disclosure. Or I could do something far less dramatic. I could leave quietly, completely, without explanation beyond what was necessary, without transferring the informal labor that had never been acknowledged as labor in the first place. That third option frightened me the most, not because it was cruel, but because it was irreversible. Once I left without explaining, there would be no opportunity to correct misunderstandings, no chance to reshape the story people told about me. I would have to accept being misunderstood forever. That was the cost. I weighed it carefully. I asked myself whether I still needed to be known as fair, as reasonable, as the person who did everything right. I examined how much of my identity was still tied to being perceived accurately by people who had never tried to see me. The answer came slowly, and then all at once. I didn't need to be understood. I needed to be gone. So I chose the option that required the least performance, the one that didn't demand validation or apology, the one that aligned with the person I had already become in silence. I chose to leave without explaining. That decision didn't feel triumphant. It felt clean, like closing a door you've already stepped through mentally. From that moment on, everything became procedural. Not emotional, not reactive, just precise. And once a decision like that is made, there is no going back to pretending it hasn't been. After the decision, nothing about my daily behavior changed enough to raise suspicion. That was intentional. Departure doesn't require drama, it requires timing. I handled things methodically, one step at a time. I separated what was mine from what was shared, not just in material terms, but in responsibility. I stopped initiating anything new. I completed only what was already expected of me. I let routines continue exactly as they had, knowing they depended on momentum more than awareness. There were practical matters to address, and I addressed them quietly. I gathered personal documents. I made copies where appropriate. I clarified my own access to accounts and information, not to take anything, but to ensure I didn't leave myself exposed. Everything I did was ordinary, legal, and unremarkable. That was the point. What I didn't do was announce my intention. There's a strange freedom in moving without commentary. No one asks questions when nothing appears to be happening. And because I had always been the steady presence, my restraint didn't register as withdrawal. It registered as normal. I also prepared myself for the absence. Not the physical one, but the psychological shift. I imagined waking up without the unspoken obligations that had structured my days. I practiced not filling the silence, not stepping in, not rescuing. Occasionally, I felt the impulse to soften the impact, to leave notes, explanations, transitional support. Old habits surfaced quietly. I let them pass, because cushioning the exit would have been one last performance of the role I was leaving. When the moment came, it wasn't marked by ceremony. No packed bags by the door, no final conversation. I waited for a natural pause, a window where my absence wouldn't immediately alarm anyone. Then I stepped out. I left behind nothing that could be claimed as a loss. No assets, no statements, no demands. I took only what was unquestionably mine, and even then I traveled light. From the outside, it did look like compliance, like acceptance, like the continuation of a story they already believed. It would take time for them to realize the story had ended. At first, nothing happened. That's the part most people don't understand when they imagine someone leaving quietly. They expect an immediate reaction, a call, a confrontation, a disruption big enough to confirm that the departure mattered. But systems built on assumptions don't fail loudly. They drift. For a while, my absence was treated as temporary, a misunderstanding, a delay. I was expected to reappear and smooth whatever had become uneven. When that didn't happen, the confusion began. Not panic, not yet, just mild disorientation. Small things started slipping. Appointments overlapped, deadlines were missed, by just enough to be inconvenient. Questions surfaced that had always been answered before anyone realized they needed to ask them. People began checking records more often, double-checking decisions that used to feel automatic. No one said my name. That was the most revealing part. My absence was being felt before it was being acknowledged. The system searched for function, not for me. And because I had never been recognized as a point of stability, no one thought to look there first. My husband grew frustrated. Not with me, at least not consciously, but with the sudden increase in friction. Things felt harder than they used to. He worked longer hours trying to compensate. He assumed the problem was external, bad timing, increased pressure, nothing structural. When he did think of me, it was with irritation rather than concern. I hadn't explained myself. I hadn't made the transition easy. From his perspective, I had simply stopped. Friends noticed the shift next. Plans became messier. Communication is less fluid. They commented on how things felt off, how coordination seemed harder than before. Some of them asked after me casually, as if I were still nearby, just momentarily unavailable. No one reached out directly, because reaching out would have required acknowledging that I had been doing something essential all along. The consequences didn't arrive as punishment. They arrived as an effort. Extra steps, additional layers of checking and correcting that had never been necessary before. The cost wasn't dramatic. It was cumulative. Time, attention, emotional energy. And slowly, quietly, something else emerged. Uncertainty. Not about me, but about the system they had trusted without understanding. The confidence that things would simply work began to erode. Decisions took longer. People hesitated where they hadn't before. There was no single problem to fix, just a growing sense that something foundational had been removed. Still, no one connected it to me, because they believed I had taken nothing with me. What they didn't realize yet was that I had taken the one thing they had never learned to replace. By the time they understood that something was wrong, they still didn't understand what it was. The early confusion hardened into stress. Not visible panic, nothing so honest, but a low, constant strain that settled into conversations and decisions. Things that once moved smoothly now require meetings, clarifications, follow-ups. The ease they had taken for granted was gone, and no one could pinpoint when it had left. My husband began reaching out, not directly at first. Questions framed as logistics, requests disguised as updates, messages that assumed proximity rather than absence. When I didn't respond the way I used to, the tone shifted. Confusion gave way to irritation. Irritation softened into concern. Concern eventually edged toward panic. He started revisiting old records, trying to reconstruct processes that had never been written down. He called people who had once deferred to me, only to realize they had never known how things actually worked, only that they did. The realization unsettled him more than anger ever could have. That's when the calls became explicit. Not apologies, not accountability, just urgency. Can you explain how this used to be handled? Do you remember where we kept? We're missing context on. I listened without answering, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. Explaining would have restored the very dependency I had stepped away from. It would have reassured them that my role could be reactivated at will, that my absence was negotiable. It wasn't. By then, the damage wasn't dramatic, but it was embedded. Decisions had been made without full understanding. Timelines had slipped. Trust in the system itself had weakened. No single fix could restore what had been lost, because what had been lost was coherence. People began asking questions they should have asked years earlier. Who was responsible for what? Why had certain checks existed? How decisions were validated? And when those questions went unanswered, frustration turned inward. Regret surfaced, not expressed, but implied. In the way conversations avoided my name, in the way explanations grew longer and less confident, in the way effort replaced ease. They finally understood that something had been broken long before I left. But by then, it was too late to fix it the way they wanted to, because fixing it would have required acknowledging that I had been more than what they assumed. And acknowledging that would have required a reckoning they were not prepared to have. So instead, they searched for substitutes, for systems, for people who could replicate what had never been formally defined. And they discovered, slowly and painfully, that what they were trying to replace wasn't a task. It was judgment, continuity, care. And those things don't transfer cleanly once they're gone. When we finally spoke, it wasn't the collision everyone imagines. There was no raised voice, no accusations were laid out like evidence, no emotional unraveling on either side. By the time he asked to meet, the urgency had cooled into something heavier, acceptance, edged with uncertainty. We sat across from each other in a quiet public place. Neutral ground. He looked tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. I noticed it without satisfaction. He started by saying he didn't understand what had happened. I let the silence stretch, not as a tactic, but because I was no longer responsible for translating the moment for him. Eventually, he filled the space with explanations, pressures, misunderstandings, how things had spiraled after I left. When he finally asked why I hadn't said anything, I answered honestly. I did, just not out loud. That was the closest thing to confrontation there would be. He wanted specifics, moments, corrections, a chance to respond retroactively. I didn't give them, not because I was withholding, but because offering them would have turned the conversation into a negotiation. And I wasn't negotiating. I told him I hadn't left to punish him. I hadn't left to teach a lesson. I left because staying required me to keep shrinking, and I was done participating in that. He asked if things could have been different. I told him maybe, but not anymore. There was no argument after that. Just the quiet recognition that whatever had been lost couldn't be recovered through explanation. The system he had relied on wasn't broken. It was gone. When we stood to leave, he looked at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time, not with admiration, not with resentment, with something closer to disorientation. I walked away without taking anything, and for the first time, he understood why that was the most unsettling outcome of all. I don't define myself by what I left anymore. For a long time after the separation, people expected a transformation they could recognize, a new role, a visible upgrade, proof that leaving had been worth it. When none of that appeared, some of them were confused, others were quietly disappointed. They wanted a narrative they could measure. I didn't give them one. Who I am now is simpler and more precise. I choose where my energy goes. I don't fill gaps unless they are mine to fill. I ask questions without apologizing for their existence, and I don't explain myself to people who benefit from misunderstanding me. I still work behind the scenes sometimes. That part of me didn't disappear. But now it's by choice, not expectation. And when I do that kind of work, it's named, bounded, and respected. Or it doesn't happen at all. The biggest change isn't external, it's internal. I no longer confuse calm with compliance. I no longer mistake endurance for virtue. Silence is still part of who I am, but it's no longer where I disappear. It's where I decide. I also don't carry bitterness. Not because what happened was acceptable, but because resentment would require me to stay emotionally invested in a system I've already left. I can see the past clearly without needing to relive it. People sometimes ask if I regret not saying more. I don't. The truth is, the people who needed explanations wouldn't have heard them when they mattered. And the people who could have understood didn't need them in the first place. What I learned is this: being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you internalize it. When you don't, it becomes camouflage. I'm not louder now. I'm not harder. I'm not performing independence. I'm simply unavailable for dynamics that require me to vanish in order to function. That has been enough. There's a story people like to tell about leaving, that it's supposed to look victorious, that freedom must arrive with a visible reward, that if you walk away and don't come back transformed in ways others can recognize, then maybe you didn't really win. I don't believe that anymore. I walked away with nothing, and that terrified them. Not because I was suddenly powerful, but because I had stepped outside the logic they understood. They believed value was measured by what could be taken, claimed, or divided. When I took nothing, they had no framework to explain what was missing. What unsettled them wasn't loss, it was exposure. Exposure to the fact that they had relied on someone they never truly seen. Exposure to how much had been sustained by a quiet presence rather than authority. Exposure to the difference between ownership and dependence. I didn't leave to make a point. I left because staying would have required me to keep negotiating my own erasure. And that's the part I want to leave you with. Sometimes, the most decisive act isn't confrontation. It isn't an explanation. It isn't even departure. Sometimes it's simply stopping. Stopping the emotional labor no one names. Stopping the quiet corrections no one notices. Stopping the habit of making yourself smaller so the system doesn't have to change. When you do that, people may accuse you of being cold, unfair, ungrateful. They may rewrite the story to protect themselves. Let them. You don't owe clarity to people who benefited from your confusion. If there's a moral here, it isn't about marriage, money, or power. It's this: being underestimated doesn't diminish you. It reveals who is unprepared for your absence. So if you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own life, If you've ever been the one who held things together quietly, only to be dismissed as replaceable, I want to ask you something, openly and honestly. What would happen if you stopped proving your value and simply chose yourself instead? If you feel comfortable, share your thoughts in the comments. I read them.
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.